Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's Bloom webinar on the topic of investing in the blue economy. My name is Camille. I am the founder of Bloom Impact Investing, and I will be your host today, as well as Leila from KapVista.
Hi everyone.
But before we start, we would like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners of the land on which this meeting is taking place today, which for me is Cairns today because I am at the Innovation Festival. So I would love to acknowledge the Gimwi Walubara Yidi as the traditional custodians and owners of the land. I pay deep respects to the elders, past, present, and future. Welcome again. It is a pleasure to see you all. For our new members today, please allow me to introduce you quickly what we do at Bloom Impact Investing and what this meetup group is all about. At Bloom, we are focusing on the impact money can have in the fight against climate change. We are on a mission to make climate impact investing easy and accessible. And part of this mission is to offer educational opportunities like these webinars to propel the voices of impact investing and sustainable finance experts far and wide. Since early this year, we have hosted many events, all touching on one or several sustainable development goals. The aim of our webinars is to build a community of impact investors and agents of change so that together we can build a greener, more circular and inclusive economy. This event is generously supported by KapVista, so I will just quickly introduce them. KapVista is a global platform showcasing private opportunities from emerging companies across 10 countries to over 15,000 high net worth individuals, professionals, and international investors, as well as family offices and industry participants. With over 8 years of experience, KapVista has built an ecosystem to share deals and create serendipity for your investment opportunity through a variety of campaigns, promotional efforts, news distribution, and tailored matchmaking with potential investors. So if you are an investor or looking for investment, make sure you connect with KapVista and Leila's team later on. Finally, quick housekeeping. Please note this event is being recorded. The webinar will be made available to the attendees after the event via email. And one last thing, I have to share with you a quick disclaimer. Please be aware that the information provided in this webinar will be general in nature only and does not constitute personal financial advice. Before acting on any information from this presentation, you should consider how appropriate it is to your personal situation. And finally, please note this is a safe space, so you can ask any questions throughout the event by typing in the chat, and we'll keep 15 minutes at the end to have some questions with anyone. So let me quickly introduce the topic of today. Today we're diving into something that I personally think is rarely covered, yet it is of the utmost importance for millions of peoples around the planet, and possibly holds a critical solution piece to solve the climate crisis, the blue economy, and the wealth and health of our oceans. Did you know that globally, the ocean is equivalent to the world's 7th largest economy? It's absolutely huge. But it's also the home of 80% of all life on the planet. And is the home, obviously, of traditional economic activities such as fishing, shipping, and tourism, but has also recently expanded to include offshore wind, deep-sea mining, and ecosystem protection. Yet, a monumental attention and funding gap exists today with advancing the blue economy. Before this event, I read a very interesting report produced by KPMG on the sustainability of the oceans. And it was reporting that the Sustainable Development Goal 14, so life below water, was one of the least prioritized SDG, with only 18% of companies prioritizing it. Isn't that crazy? So this is obviously a major gap in our impact investing ecosystem, but also a huge opportunity. And to dive into this topic today, we are very, very lucky to have not only a researcher, absolute expert on the topic, Irene, but also an entrepreneur who's really pushing the boundaries of the blue economy, Ewan. So I'll just quickly say a word about both of them and then we'll dive into the event. So Professor Irene Penesis, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. So Irene, you are the director. You are the research director for the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Center, and you have led an investment worth 7 million into R&D in the first 2 years of the center across all fields of sustainable aquaculture and offshore renewable energy production. Irene is also on secondment from the University of Tasmania, really leading the way in that blue economy for sure, where she led a multidisciplinary research team working in the field of marine renewable energy, and contributes to educating maritime engineering students at the Australian Maritime College, but also the National Centre for Maritime Engineering and Hydrodynamics. That sounds very complex and intelligent. But Irene also worked with the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, also known as ARENA, a funded project on tidal energy in Australia. So this is also fascinating. She also collaborated with the CSIRO, the University of Queensland, and many other key organizations in the blue economy. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the panel today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now we'll introduce Ewan. There is so much to say about Ewan, but I attempted to summarize his career in a few sentences, which was definitely a challenge. So Ewan is the founder and director of SmartOysters, amongst many other things. But Ewan is also a marine biologist, truffle farming scholar, and has been an industry trailblazer since 2004.
2004.
2004, thank you. Something's not right in what I just said. His passion and focus is to improve not only his own farm, but the industry as a whole. Ewan is the founder of SmartOysters, an innovating farm operations management app, the only aquaculture app focused on farm operations, specifically addressing the needs of small to medium scale farms. So I won't say too much more than this because we'll dive into it a little bit later. Thank you so much, Ewan, for joining us. Are you joining us from the farm? I have to ask.
Yes, yeah, I've got a little old farm shed that I use as an office. So
beautiful.
I could throw a coffee cup to the water.
That sounds lovely. That sounds really lovely. All right, so without further ado, let's dive into it. So we've got myself and Leila have a few questions, so we'll just bounce each other, and essentially feel free to jump in whenever you want to give an answer. So the first one is, actually I'll let maybe, Leila, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure. So our first question, hi everyone, I'm Leila. Our first question is going to be, what is the blue economy and what are the characteristics of it in Australia?
Well, I can probably go first if you like, Ewan, and you can jump in if you like. The blue economy is, a very widely used term, and it's generally in an economic sense talking about the scope of international development when we describe a sustainable development approach to using our coastal resources. It's a pretty widely used term, and it includes a range of economic sectors. The more traditional sectors that people associate it with are marine and coastal tourism, oil and gas, fisheries and inshore aquaculture, shipping and ports, marine observations. They're sort of your more typical traditional sectors. But as we're starting to see some emergence in the blue economy and the ocean economy, people are predicted to see much more variation and change in areas such as offshore renewable energy, offshore aquaculture, marine ecosystem services. So people talk a lot about blue carbon, seabed mining, and even some of the marine biotechnology. So I probably would say that about what it is generally. But in terms of, what the characteristics are in Australia, I mean, we think about Australia's blue economy, it's pretty vast opportunity actually to grow our blue economy. We've got the third largest exclusive economic zone with over 80% being classified as offshore. And that all is beyond 2 nautical miles from the coast. So, you know, and if we look at Australia's exclusive economic zone, you know, that's tropical, subtropical, temperate, Antarctic environments that really can support a diverse range of aquaculture, but also being home to some of the best ocean energy resources of anywhere in the world. Ewan, you might like to add something.
I would only say that another sort of unique characteristic of the blue economy is that it's a huge driver of regional employment. You know, so because it's the ocean and we're surrounded by it, there's opportunities for, you know, coastal towns and more remote areas actually to, you know, to drive economic, you know, activity.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. Jobs, wealth, supply chains, goods and services, I think they're a critical element. Agree.
Thank you both. That's a great overview of the sector. It is so broad that it was worth introducing. My follow-up question is on the investment landscape. So like we just explained, it's really wide and varied, but can you unpack for us the key opportunities and maybe the gaps that you are seeing in this sector? Where are we needing funding the most?
Obviously, I could talk, Camille, from the aquaculture perspective. So huge opportunity in aquaculture to grow. Just in my own industry in New South Wales, there's I think only 50% of the oyster leases are actually under production and definitely not at full production. So a huge opportunity to growth in shellfish, which is a sustainable, you know, seafood product. We're also seeing huge interest in seaweed and growing seaweed, not just for edible seafood or pharmaceuticals, but also in carbon sequestration. There's projects happening, and also more recently in the methane reducing seaweed. So the aquaculture industry in Australia is relatively underdeveloped. Our strongest industry, probably most well-known ones, are the salmon industry and potentially tuna ranching down in South Australia with a few abalone farms, but very small industry compared to what we could do.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I probably add a couple things to that, which are probably some really important aspects across what's important in Australia. And that's we've got a global reputation for quality, safe and sustainable seafood and management and marine natural resources and biodiversity. And although our fisheries are relatively small by world standards, you know, we see Australia importing about 72% of its seafood. Although, you know, we've got very limited capacity to sustainably increase wild catch seafoods, we think the sustainable growth is going to happen from aquaculture. And as Ewan said, we've got mature inshore aquaculture industries like the salmonoid industry, mussels, oysters, you know, abalone, prawns, for example, that are servicing domestic and international customers. But aquaculture probably is over 36% of that total volume. And so we actually see there being major opportunities for expansion of aquaculture into Commonwealth waters. And that's purely because we think that there's some limited availability of nearshore production sites. And so there's a lot of competition with lots of other sectors in inshore waters, you know, from wild fisheries, navigational aspects, recreational users, conservation users. And so we're seeing a lot of the expansion happening offshore. I think that aspect also is really important from the renewable energy aspect as well. And I say that because we have some of the best ocean resources of any country in the world, best offshore wind, wave, tidal resources. And so we've got this enormous potential to deliver energy to support not only these offshore operations, but also exportable renewable energy products like hydrogen. And a lot of this is just adjacent to all our coasts. And I don't think people recognise the scale, but our offshore wind resource in Australia is equivalent to Europe, the US and the UK combined. And if we look at where some of those best wind resources are, they're in the southern parts of Australia, Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and Tasmania, and New South Wales. And so I think that this is an area in Australia that's been very underdeveloped. And so I think that's probably one of the critical areas that the Blue Economy CRC is also interested in working in, but we also see a benefit in helping provide decarbonisation solutions and reduction of emissions in the marine environment generally for industry that are operating there.
Just if I can add just another point, the Australian government has stated that aquaculture is leading the seafood pandemic recovery. So salmon, prawns, and oysters are expected to help lift the sector back into positive. So it's going to help in the industry overall.
Interesting, a huge untapped potential. I have a follow-on question, maybe for Ewan this time. Tell us more about, from your perspective, what are you seeing in terms of opportunities in the farming and fishing industry specifically?
Yeah, for sure. So one, there's a huge interest in investment, and also start off, there's a huge demand for seafood, as we just described, both domestically and export. So there's huge demand for seafood. What Australia does have, as Irene said, is we've got clean, green waterways and a really safe, a reputation for really safe food. And we've also got technology. So in terms of opportunity, as I said, and I'm really coming from the grassroots perspective, like right down on the ground. I can see there's huge investment to be made in increasing shellfish production, in both oysters and mussels. And again, I was talking about the seaweed. The biggest challenge, I think, the industry, and this is where technology plays a part in both harvesting and software. But the biggest challenge with aquaculture and seafood and investing in it, one is actually it's generally undercapitalized. So farmers and aquaculturists cannot borrow money against their oyster leases. So we are looking for alternative sources of capital. And then from an investor point of view, it's very it's very hard to understand aquaculture. You can't walk around an aquaculture farm. It's under the water. So from that perspective, we do need to sort of de-risk the sector by making it more visible, understand the risks understandable, and I would say there's other huge opportunities in technology which Australia does well, in both cultivation, management of aquaculture, and then in the supply chain. So
yeah, maybe I can add something to that as well. And that is that, when we talk about, at least in the Blue Economy CRC, moving industries into offshore environments, they're really moving into very exposed environments. And this is something that Ewan has picked up on, which is around it being a major opportunity, but it comes with technical challenges. And some of the areas that we have identified in the Blue Economy CRC with our 40 participants and with the Commonwealth Government's support is that we need to be developing new technologies and infrastructure that allows these industries to expand offshore. We need to help them lower the cost of those operations, and that might be through increasing their use of renewables and decarbonising their activities. We need to think about advancing the materials that we use to design these structures so that they have increased longevity and reliability in the marine environment. We need to improve our environmental management of our oceans, just more generally. And I think we need to be developing a regulatory framework that advocates for confidence for the industry to invest and for the public to have confidence that all of these activities are going to be happening at the highest environmental standards. And I think exactly what Ewan has said, that being able to translate a lot of the science and technology into commercial activity will support our industry partners to create that type of advantage in this evolving market.
I'll just jump back in and just say, like, the global aquaculture industry is like a $260 billion industry. It's employing more than 20 million people. What we do know about Australia is not only can we grow stuff here in the water, but we can also export the technology, the services, all that stuff. So, and then that's the opportunity, is that global aquaculture is growing, and we are, we have best practice right here in Australia that we can export.
Yuan, so talking about this, I'm going to jump into my next question. You're a great example of someone that worked in the industry, identified a problem, and built a solution that turned into a scalable and profitable business. Can you tell us a little bit more about SmartOysters?
Yes, sure. I'll give you guys a bit of a background for my journey, I guess, in aquaculture. I did do a marine biology degree when I was in my early 20s. I was interested in aquaculture. I did some prawn farming and fish farming, but sort of fell into oyster farming because it was a great area for it on the south coast. My father was actually interested. He kept ringing me up wanting to do something. He used to be a commercial fisherman before he had got an office job. And he suggested oysters. I said, you know what, Dad, it's a sustainable industry. Oysters grow naturally in commercial quantities in the environment. We don't have to feed them. We don't have to treat them. And the South Coast is quite a good area for it. The next week he rang me up and said, I've quit my job and I've bought an oyster farm. And it's a good story, but also what's interesting about it is that, so I did sort of, jump into that and, work 7 days a week to sort of upgrade that oyster farm. I was very naive. I thought, I'd taken over a farm that had been run by an older couple. And I thought I'll just work twice as hard and I'll make twice as much money. That wasn't to be the case. We had to modernize the farm, make it more efficient, use more systems. I then still wasn't making enough money through the traditional supply channels. So I founded Signature Oysters, which sells oysters direct to restaurants and now online. So we're creating greater value for our product, nearly 30% more. And even then, so I had a more efficient farm, I had a better market. But what I found is that I couldn't stay over that decade of oyster farming. I'd become the single point of failure. I was the only one that knew what to do or when to do it. And even though we had some software management system, we had some management systems on running the day-to-day operations of the farm, it still was mostly in my memory as I was the key person. I went looking for a solution to solve this. It was like the missing link for me. And we created SmartOysters, which is a GPS application that helps farmers record and schedule farm activity, so an operations app. What's exciting about SmartOysters, and I think leads to this sort of conversation, is that it sort of captures in a nutshell the challenge of working on the water and that unique farm practice that every aquaculture farm, but it turns out most farms have, where when you're operating in a certain environment, in a certain place, you've got challenges such as wind, weather, environment. You cannot walk around the farm, it's underwater. So how do you not only capture the expertise of the people that can work on that water, but then scale it up? And that's particularly important for investors listening today, is like aquaculture has the potential to have huge impact, and we just need to be able to scale it up. The other thing is probably best to understand, and this is interesting, is that about 90% of the aquaculture in the world is classed as small scale. So mostly family size farms, producing most of that production. And in my case with SmartOysters, being grassroots, that's the problem I solved. Turns out 90% of the industry has that same problem as well. But that's what I can see huge opportunity. It's not about massive sea farms, necessarily. It's about how do we scale up, make small farms more efficient, help them not just create sustainable seafood, but also have sustainable livelihoods and have a sort of social economic impact as well.
And you can scale for not just for oysters as well. You can go to other markets.
Yeah, it's really interesting with oysters. We were sort of lucky in the fact that oysters are sustainable. We don't feed or treat them. So we weren't sort of clouded with this idea of measuring the inputs and outputs. A lot of management systems on farms are about measuring, seed or chemical or feed. It's a high cost, input to any farming system. Without having that in the picture with oysters, we could focus directly on operations. It's all about labor efficiency with oysters, the stock movements. And it's probably interesting to people listening, on day-to-day farm, on our farm, for example, what do you do if you're an oyster farmer? Is that we've got 40,000 oyster baskets out there. We're only got it's a small farm, 4 or 5 full-time employees, 40,000 oyster baskets. We handle 600 to 1,000 of them a day. They can be picked up or deployed at anywhere of 200 different locations. There's 16 different sizes. There's 8 different crops, and they've all to ensure the quality. They all need to be graded every 4 months or dried every 2 weeks. And so that sort of stock movement is the kind of stuff that that stock movement is what we're sort of recording on a day-to-day basis, and that's the challenge of, on any given day, what do we have to go and do, and where and when. And in terms of scalability, what we did by focusing on operations, by understanding, Layla, that no farm is the same. We're not we can't standardize farming. And so we've sort of gone to farmers now with a customizable app, recognizing that they've got their own unique farm practice. And that's true for just about all aquaculture, and definitely even agriculture. So in terms of being able to scale SmartOysters or scale this idea of unique farm practice, that's key in understanding that, capturing that from farmers with the app, and then being able to transfer that knowledge so that they can employ more people, or they can give investors visibility of farm activities and have greater understanding, and ultimately de-risk aquaculture, like de-risk farms that we want to invest in.
Thank you. That was great, and a good insight into your business. I have a question on I guess impact investing. So in this group, we have impact investors who love to invest in obviously growth opportunities, but also they want to make sure they are delivering a positive impact. So my question is to Irene, where do you think is the low-hanging fruit in terms of impact? Where should investors go to maximize their impact? You're on mute.
I think that might be an opportunity, I think, both for Ewan and I maybe to speak to, because he probably has an interest in it from the oysters production. But I think we're starting to see a lot of interest in the seaweed space, and this is maybe something that Ewan and I can probably talk a lot about. It's a very immature industry in Australia, but they predict it to be worth, over $3 million. And the majority of this, they believe, will come from the production of seaweeds offshore. And currently, most of it is just through the collection and processing of storm-cast kelp that they find on beaches in Tasmania and South Australia. But they expect this industry to be worth $1.5 billion. I think the seaweed industry, has the opportunity to employ, they say 9,000 people. So it's another massive aquaculture industry. But in addition, I think it also has the opportunity to look at recultivation of existing kelp forests that have been degraded over many years in different places in Australia due to climate change. They have the opportunity to provide carbon sequestration. So that's where they are able to hold carbon as a value. So that's great that we can take that out of the environment. They have a great opportunity as part of an ecosystem service that you can look at the way in which seaweeds can attract new biodiversity to an environment as well. And even if we think about it, even down the track in terms of products, there's a lot of interest at the moment in products that come from this, whether it's pharmaceuticals using seaweeds, whether it's fertilizers and feeds that are using seaweeds. And so this is becoming a really exciting area, I think, of development. And I think an area that investors will be looking at, which has, I think, speaks very much to our sustainability and really good environmental practices, but also benefits just generally to the industry as well and the economy. Ewan, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I love sustainable aquaculture. I think it's got it's huge impact. I can sort of, and it goes from growing oysters, for example. There is no inputs. In terms of what we do. It's one of the oysters, mussels, that shellfish is one of the few industries that you can really scale up and do more of, and only have a beneficial impact. How? Well, oysters obviously are filtering nutrients out of the water, so they're reducing nutrient load from wash off. There's an ecosystem services, so they're replacing in part a lot of the lost habitat that is the fish nurseries. That it's actually probably the biggest impact on the reduction of fish stocks. It's not necessarily overfishing; it's the fact that there's nowhere for fish to recruit. So the oysters are there creating a habitat. They're also cleaning the water. They're actually definitely assisting, replacing that habitat for fish recruitment to replace those stocks. As I mentioned earlier before, aquaculture is done in the water. It's not concentrated necessarily, and it can be a huge driver of social, regional employment. Definitely here in Australia, it's a job that many people, and definitely First Nations people, enjoy doing. As opposed to going and living in the city. So it's good in that way. And I think Irene obviously talked about seaweed, but it's just definitely an industry with just huge potential to do good, and actually the impact is easy to measure. I think in terms of production tons of seafood. We've got the science out there to look at carbon sequestration, nitrogen sequestration as well. So yeah.
I think probably as well, we focused a lot about aquaculture, but there's also in the provision of the blue economy, the renewables is a really important aspect as well. And people are talking a lot about renewable energy, such as hydrogen as well. And we've got a very big focus in Australia around hydrogen, and that's everything from the architecture of the microgrids and the systems and the components of those microgrids, but also the actual generation of hydrogen and what it can be used for. And so for those who probably don't understand very much about hydrogen, it's produced through electrolysis of water. And by splitting water, we get hydrogen and we also get oxygen. And both of those products are through, if you're doing it using renewable energy sources like solar or onshore wind or offshore wind, means that it's a clean fuel. And it can be converted back to storage of energy the same way that we use batteries. It can be used to convert it to electricity. It can be used to be converted into a liquid form. People talk about using liquid hydrogen, or they talk about ethanol or ammonia, and those can be used in vessels. They can run the same way that we use diesel fuel in diesel engines. We can use ammonia to run those engines as well. And so there's lots of people talking about renewables, and I think this is a really massive opportunity, I think, to contribute to carbon mitigation measures for industries that rely very heavily on fossil fuels for their power of their operations. And that includes lots of different industries, not just aquaculture industries, but also it includes the fisheries industry with their fleet of vessels. It might also include any onshore facilities that are utilised, ports and harbours, the maritime industry as a whole, generally.
Irene, my next question is for you. For investors that are new to this area, what are your tips on how to invest smartly in the blue economy?
I think this is a really good question. I think I see this probably in a lot of different areas when I think about the legacy that I think the Blue Economy CRC could leave behind. But I do think that there is opportunities in the new technologies that we will use in offshore environments. There's a lot of things that we don't know how to do yet operating offshore, in particular how we're going to service these offshore platforms or offshore structures or farms that we generate. If we want to do that more sustainably, we may want to remove people out of harm's way when they're operating in very exposed environments. And so autonomous technologies and systems and sensors are going to be really critical to help people monitor, manage and mitigate any risks in offshore environments. And so that's something that we probably haven't picked up, but that type of technology is going to be really important even for emerging products like seaweeds. I think there's a lot of sustainability around the materials that we use in maritime structures. I think that there's some work that we can do in improving the materials that we use so that we can use polymers that are more biodegradable or safer for the environment. And that includes, of course, the use of plastics. I also think that there's some work that can be done then in terms of the circular economy, in terms of making sure that we recycle and repurpose existing infrastructure to support new activities. You know, people talk a lot about the repurposing of existing oil and gas infrastructure to support aquaculture offshore or renewable energy offshore. So there's some of the areas that at least I've come up with, but I'm really happy to throw it over to you, and he might want to add something as well.
Investing smartly in aquaculture, the blue economy. I guess the old mantra is that often there's technology looking for solutions, whereas I would advise any investor go and find someone who's got go and invest in someone. For example, myself, that as solving a problem. It has a compelling problem and they're solving it and a vision to grow. So I think that's the only advice I could give, is that there is plenty of people out there that are doing innovative things, actually growing produce or delivering great outcomes. Get behind those people.
I'd probably add one more, and that is, there's a really important space that needs to change, which is the policy and regulatory framework in Australia to support offshore food and energy production, or whatever we do in our offshore environments. Currently, we don't have any regulation that supports offshore developments other than for oil and gas. And so currently a lot of that activity falls to Australia's EPBC Act and to the states to manage. But if we really are interested in growing our blue economy, we're really going to need to put some resources behind mapping out what the policy and legislative frameworks are in Australia and how we can help change those to support future investment in offshore developments by changing these policies to be more conducive to support investors and for industry as well.
Thank you, Irene. Great remark. And actually, it's a perfect segue to my next question around investment vehicles. So to support, it takes an ecosystem, right, to support an economy. So what investments vehicles are you seeing as an opportunity to protect our oceans? Do we need more government funding? Do we need blue bonds? Do we need listed companies to lead the way? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll probably just start by saying that I'm very fortunate to be in a leading position, at least when it comes to Australia's blue economy, and having had the Commonwealth Government invest $70 million in the blue economy CRC. So that's been fantastic. Alongside that, our 40 participants who come from 9 other countries as well as Australia, who are made up of state governments, different regulators, industry, aquaculture, energy, offshore engineering companies, and also research organisations are really working really closely together. And all together, we have about $330 million over the next 10 years to invest in helping support, Australia's blue economy. I do think, though, that is not enough. That recently the Australian government was part of a high-level panel on oceans, and one of the outcomes of that is that there is going to be investment from the Australian government, $100 million into the sustainability of our oceans. And so I think that was only announced a couple months ago, and it's probably an area that I think has been lacking. And so hearing, our Australian Prime Minister talk about the management of our oceans and the task of reducing emissions, thinking about doing more appropriate spending in marine spatial planning, regulation, First Nations through their views around the blue economy and how we can support them, and even blue carbon accounting, to hear those kind of announcements, I think is fantastic. But I think we need to do much more across the industry and through the government to make those opportunities available to many others. Being from a research organisation, now being part of a new R&D company, I've had a lot of experience in working with governments around Australian grants, so maybe I can speak to that. But I do believe that there is enormous opportunities, of course, for us to work very closely with our research sectors to help drive that type of innovation and industry-focused R&D that's needed. And so there are opportunities as well that I think industry can exploit with the Australian research organisations and with government as well. And lastly, to say that, you know, the Blue Economy CRC is always working with new potential external stakeholders that also share the same vision that the Blue Economy CRC has. And so if there are industry partners out there that have an idea and they're really interested in understanding how they can develop it for a market, for a future Blue Economy market or a current Blue Economy market, you know, I'd really urge them to get in touch with me and to have a chat with the Blue Economy CRC.
Wonderful, thank you. We might have enough time for one last question, and then we'll open up the floor to the audience. So I'm going to ask about future predictions, and I would love to hear from both of you. Where do you see the future opportunities for growth and impact? What are your predictions for the blue economy?
I'll jump in first. Sorry, you did some talking. So when I'm looking at the aquaculture, we're working with oyster farmers, mussel farmers, seaweed farmers, fish farmers around the world. Shrimp, I hope to be working with shrimp farmers as well. I think we always sort of come back to seaweed as being this huge opportunity. One of the reasons is that there's sort of three elements to it. As I said, there's an edible element to it. It's a sustainable food, very healthy food, and pharmaceutical sort of value there as well. Plus we can do carbon sequestration, and we can also reduce methane. But most importantly is that the capital cost of actually rolling out a seaweed farm seaweed grows so quickly is a lot lower. It's a lot easier for us to have impact, and actually, you know, it's one of those industries we can see that we can actually accelerate the growth and have impact fast. So that's where I see the benefit. And I'll just say that just on that question prior is that I think there's a huge opportunity to create investment vehicles for aquaculture. Like that's where the opportunity is now, to actually, let's figure out how to be innovative about the way we can invest in aquaculture or the blue economy, because it is a different space and it's crying out for investment.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to keep it very short because I think Ewan's covered it pretty well. But I think Australia's got an opportunity to be a world leader in sustainable seafood, aquaculture and renewable energy production. I think that we have an opportunity to service a global market that's worth more than $3 trillion by the OECD by 2030. And I think that we can do that sustainably with the best practices in mind, and use of some very upcoming exciting technologies that need to be developed. And I'd say put your money in Australia and invest it in local companies that can help support that to happen here in Australia, and then let's export it to the rest of the world.
Oh yeah, I'm going to say that too. I'm going to give yourself a plug and say, you know, the opportunities in the technology. Like let's invest in the technology that we could take to the world, like SmartOysters.
Talking about investing in Australian company, let's talk about SmartOysters. They are currently raising capital with us at KapVista, so if you'd like more information, please contact me. Ewan, what is the momentum with your offer? How is your fundraising going?
Oh, so it's going great. We're actually crowdfunding at the moment. We've got 180 investors signed. We've got a target of 600K with only 6 days to go. And yeah, the response has been amazing. So a lot of oyster-loving, sustainable investors so far, but definitely after some investors that are looking for impact with some bigger check sizes, because yeah, just to go back about the opportunity is massive. You know what I've sold for my farm, and I had that moment, you know, where I realised that is a global problem, and there's tens of thousands of farms around the world that are actually producing, sustainable food, seafood right now. And we want to put SmartOysters technology in their hands so that, they can grow more sustainable seafood and they can be more efficient, and, they can have create a great livelihood doing it as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Ewan. That's a great insight, and I really encourage everyone on the webinar today to reach out to Leila or the SmartOysters team. They are obviously really passionate and doing a great job, so reach out, and I think you can still register your interest for their fundraising campaign. We have a question from the audience that I find really interesting, so I'm going to ask on their behalf. What is for you the best way to get rid of net waste, improve the fishing systems in the ocean that cause so much damage to our wildlife? So we're talking plastic issues here with the fishing industry. Do you have insights on this topic?
I'm obviously in the aquaculture, but my insight is that it is like it is about technology. It's about investing in better technology so that the guys out there aren't losing gear, breaking gear, and potentially supporting those less developed countries with their fishing technology, because that often that's again, when we come back to any sort of aquaculture, but even fisheries, is that it's generally underbanked. You can't borrow money against your boat or the water you're growing. So most of these seafood companies they just don't have that facility to continue to upgrade infrastructure. So that's where investment is required, just to help fishers, farmers actually improve their improve their methods. No fisher that you'd have ever talked to or aquaculturalists wants to leave gear behind or have that impact environment. They're often conservationists themselves. So I think it's all about helping them do a better job.
Thank you. Yeah, give them the right tools to do the right thing. We have another question on offshore regenerative energy systems. So that might be a question for Irene. So Alexander asks, offshore regenerative energy seems to come with a really high risk due to the hostile environment. Is there any technology that has succeeded in dealing with it on a long-term basis and producing energy at a cost comparable to solar?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say that the International Energy Agency, Ocean Energy Systems Group, has been working at putting data out there for quite a long time right now about offshore renewable energy systems. And when we talk about them, we talk about, wave technologies, tidal technologies, offshore wind, sometimes is in a separate category. People are talking about floating solar. Ocean thermal gradients, there's lots of different technologies. I'd say that a lot of the ones that are in the marine renewable energy space have been emerging technologies. Tidal energy probably has had the greatest growth, I think, in the last 10, 15 years in terms of R&D. And we're starting to see very big, large-scale commercial tidal projects happening in Europe. The first one, of course, has been by a company called Sibmec Atlantis Energy, who are based in Scotland, who are developing a 400 megawatt tidal farm. And so, they've made substantial developments there with their technology that produce quite a lot of energy in those fast-flowing environments, water environments. We haven't seen that type of activity happen in Australia just yet. We've seen lots of investment and activity happen in wave energy in Australia, and we've got companies in Australia who've been developing a lot of that technology, and some have had successes, but I'd say some have also had failures. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. I think that one of the areas that I think has always been a possible help to this industry is just the fact that there is so much understanding, skills in the offshore engineering sector, and that's all your maritime engineering type sectors that work for oil and gas, that really hasn't transferred to supporting emerging industries, whether it's an existing very mature industry like aquaculture that's trying to design new novel structures to move offshore, or whether it's the current marine energy industry that's trying to design technologies that can survive in the environment that they're placed on in Australia. And I'd say that there's still a long way to go to encourage more research and more industry involvement in those sectors. And I think we're starting to see a transition now. And of course, we've seen a massive development in offshore wind in Europe that hasn't occurred yet in Australia, but we've got one very big project being proposed and has made some headway, which is the Star of the South in Gippsland. And there's another 11 offshore wind projects that are being proposed. So we should start to see some offshore wind developments. I'd say that offshore wind is, in the UK, has been marked within 10 years to be as competitive with the gas sector and the onshore solar sector. So hopefully some of those numbers will translate in Australia, but our electricity market is a very different market to the European market. So I think we need to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, it's very promising anyway.
Very, very promising.
Thank you. We have a question from an attendee that is interested in seaweed. Can you share with us a few companies that are doing really well in this sector?
Ewan, would you like to start, or would you like me to start?
Well, you start and I'll cover off. I'll fill the gaps, because I know you've got some initiatives down there in Tasmania, which seems to be the seaweed capital of Australia.
It sure is. A lot of people have interest in temperate climate seaweeds, both for Australia and New Zealand. I'd say that there's a lot of different companies you can talk to. The Blue Economy CRC is one that's working with several seaweed companies in investing in, helping them develop the technologies that they need to expand and develop their farms and their products. I'd also say that the Australian Seaweed Institute is a major player in this space. They were funded by AgriFutures Australia to develop a seaweed blueprint for Australia. So that's someone that you could definitely talk to. And that's Joe Kelly. In Tasmania, we've got a few different players that have got interest, but they're not all just based in Tasmania. We've got the Southern Ocean Carbon Company, which is an NGO with strong interest in sustainable seaweed production. We've got Kelp Blue, and that's a company that's an international company from overseas, but has a strong footing in Australia and is looking to develop projects in Tasmania and New Zealand. We've got the Climate Foundation. The Climate Foundation has been doing temperate and tropical species, and they're really interested in mariculture, which is more than one species grown together in an ecosystem services approach. And they're looking at some really nifty ways in which you can produce seaweeds and then sink them to the bottom of the ocean to help get that carbon in that location. There's been a lot of success with companies like Sea Forest, which is a Tasmanian NGO that just raised $34 million to grow a type of seaweed near shore. And then there's other companies like CH4 Global as well. So look, there's quite a few of them. Ewan might have others to add to the list, but I'd say that the Australian Seaweeds Institute blueprint that they released only a few months ago really details all of the activity that's happening in Australia and who you can talk to.
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered off, Irene, in Australia. SmartOysters is working with, very excited actually to be working with, and it's a good demonstration of how exciting seaweed could be. But we've just recently started working with Bren Smith, who is an oyster farmer turned seaweed farmer on the east coast of the US. And it's really about regenerative ocean farming. So, getting, people to become farmers and grow seaweed. So not just about, capturing carbon or food, but actually creating jobs and sustainable living. Bren has nearly 8,000 people signed up to learn how to seaweed farm with him just on the East Coast. So not only is, just exciting for SmartOysters, and I think just for aquaculture industry, like that's the kind of scale and interest there is in growing sustainable seafood.
That's wonderful. Such a strong interest and a lot of opportunities for the future. Unfortunately, I think that is all what we have time for today. So we are going to wrap up quickly. But thank you so much, both of you, for answering the questions. I will just remind everyone that after this event, I will be sending an email with our speakers' details, and you can learn more about what they do and maybe reach out to connect and learn more about what they do. I hope this webinar gave you practical knowledge and insights into impact investing and how powerful it can be when it's connected to the blue economy.